This is the Digging for Truth podcast, presented by the Associates for Biblical Research, demonstrating the historical reliability of the Bible through archaeological and biblical research.
If you love deep dives, I think you're really going to enjoy today's conversation. Henry Smith is here, and I can see he already has a ton of questions to ask, so I think we should probably get started. So, Henry, who's our guest with you?
Today, I'm very, very pleased to have with me someone who's become a friend, and a growing friend, I would say, a growing friendship and partnership with many commonalities and common ideas that we share and beliefs, and that is Dr. Marcus Ross. Dr. Ross is a paleontologist, and he joins us today. Welcome, Marcus, to the show.
Oh, thanks so much, Henry. It's great to be back on Digging for Truth with you guys. It's always a great joy for me to watch your episodes and just a real privilege to be on one with you.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. We've had you on our TV show. We talked about monstrous mosasaurs.
Yeah,
that was a lot of fun, right? And a little bit of historical Adam stuff in our TV show, but we touched on a little. Now today we're going to be talking about a book that you participated in writing, 4 views or perspectives on the historical Adam and Eve, and there was 4 contributors, one of which. Of course, you were. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that unfolded, and maybe how those doors opened up for you, and then just broadly speaking, maybe for folks who are not as familiar with the young Earth creationist perspective, the broad strokes of our viewpoint, which largely you and I agree on.
Mm. Well, it's an interesting story of how this came to be, in part because of decisions that I was making at the time that were completely outside of this project. As you mentioned, I'm a paleontologist, and my background is in vertebrate paleontology. So I studied animals with backbones, and we had that episode on mosasaurs. Those were the swimming marine reptiles that I studied for my PhD and my master's work. I've done a little bit of work with dinosaur stuff, as kind of you almost sort of always end up doing that in vertebrate paleontology. So I like big, toothy, lizardy things. I always have. It's just a lot of fun to study those types of animals. I've studied fossil mammals as well in the Cenozoic materials, and a variety of different sorts of things. And what makes this interesting is that, I'm an introvert, which means I'm not a people person. But as a vertebrate paleontologist, I'm also not a people person. The human fossil record was something that I was not terribly interested in for a long time. It was just kind of a mess with not very much material and data. Although in the last couple of decades, there's just been this massive renaissance. And so I came to this work very sort of reluctantly, but with an amazing example of kind of how God decides to time something. So in 2020, the end of 2020, around Thanksgiving, December, my wife and I decided that our business here at Cornerstone Educational Supply was growing large enough that I could possibly step aside from teaching at Liberty University, where I served teaching geology, paleontology. I was the director of the Center for Creation Studies there. And so we decided over Christmas break that we were going to step out and we were going to try and run our company, and that would be the family business. And part of the reason for doing that was that as our company grew and I still had my job at Liberty, there was increasingly less time available for me to do creation research and be involved in this kind of dialogue about origins. And so really, the motivation for leaving Liberty was not being dissatisfied with teaching. I love teaching, but rather, we had to pick a pony here. And so we decided to go with Cornerstone. 2 weeks after I told my dean, I get an email out of the blue from William Lane Craig, the most noted Christian apologist and philosopher in the world. And I don't know William Lane Craig. I mean, I know him, right? But we're not friends.
Right.
We're not connected. We're not on Facebook together or anything like that. But so I get this email from William Lane Craig just 2 weeks after telling my dean I'm stepping down, and he invites me to participate in this book on Adam. And it's kind of just one of those things where you see the Lord's hand say, oh, you want to do more work with me? Okay, yeah, I'll let you do
Yeah.
more work with me. Here's an opportunity to stand aside some exceptional scholars and present the case for a recent creation of Adam and Eve and a recent creation for the world. So I said yes. I was very, very pleased to be able to do that, and I had been starting to get drawn into this realm of human origins through the work of Dr. Joshua Swamidass, who has a perspective that's kind of represented in this book. And kind of critiquing some other perspectives out there. So I'd been drawn into this a little bit and started to realize, I'm getting a good handle on what's going on with this. And so I was willing to jump in and represent a young Earth creation perspective. As you mentioned, there's 4 perspectives in the book, and kind of going front to back. The book is edited by Ken Keithley, who's at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. And the 4 contributors offering the different perspectives are, number 1, Kenton Sparks, and he stands kind of outside evangelicalism. He holds to an errantist view of the Bible. So he thinks that the Bible is God's communication to us, but through people, definitely through people, and it makes mistakes and errors, but God is using that nonetheless. He kind of views the Bible as like a lot of sermons, in a sense, about God. But he still believes that Jesus Christ is the risen Lord and Messiah, the Son of God, born of a virgin, those sorts of things. So he still is in Christianity, but definitely not in the evangelical camp. And so his perspective is that the authors of Genesis thought that they were giving us a real history of a recent creation, a global flood, a original pair of parents, but we know that's not true now because of the discoveries of science and critical biblical scholarship and all that sort of stuff. So he just says, there isn't a conflict between there is a conflict between the Bible and science, but we shouldn't expect the Bible to have gotten it right in the first place. So we'll just have to understand Adam in some different way. He's a moral example. He's a story that we can learn from, but it's not going to match up with science, nor should we even try to make it. So he's just going to let the Bible say what it says, and he's going to let science say what it says, and if the two meet, great. If they don't, didn't expect it. So he takes a very different perspective than what a lot of our listeners here would think would be normal for Christianity.
Could I paraphrase that and tell me if this is accurate? So if I understood him right, he's basically saying, yes, the text says there was historical Adam and Eve. Yes, the text says there was a global flood. That's what the text actually says, but he doesn't think that happened in temporal reality the way that you and I would argue is the case. Is that right?
Absolutely.
It's kind of interesting. As you explain the other two views, you'll see the difference of how it's so interesting. He agrees with us formally in terms of what the text is teaching us. Or what it says, I should say. Maybe not what it's teaching us, but exactly what it says. So anyway, I didn't mean to interject there too much, but I that stuck out to me.
It really did, and you see that especially in the discussions that we have in the book. Because one of the nice things about a book like this, right, is it's a debate in page form, and so we all lay out our case with a primary chapter, and then each of us has an opportunity to critique the other authors, and then the authors have a brief response. And one of the things that you see between the dialogue of Kenton Sparks and myself is, we actually have a whole lot of points of agreement about what we think the Bible is trying to tell us about this and what the ancient authors believe to be the historical truth. And so we stand as end members, even as Kenton says, I think one time in the book, every one of these books needs a good liberal, and I'm the one who's put in service for that. And, I could be, okay, we need a left-wing nut job and we need a right-wing crackpot. That's supposed to be me, right? And in the middle are supposed to be, the ones that are straddling both sides and trying to come up with a good compromise or a good
the reasonable moderates.
Right. And I think part of the fun part for me in this book is I don't think it worked out that way for the readers on this one. But nonetheless, it was really neat because a year, I guess 2 years before the book officially came out, we had a colloquium where Kenton and myself and a bunch of others got to Southeastern. Bill Craig was supposed to be there, but he got a terrible case of COVID and pneumonia at the same time and was hospitalized. And Andrew Loke, who's another one of the contributors, he couldn't make it because he wasn't sure if he'd be able to get back into Hong Kong where he teaches if he left, because, again, it was still kind of during COVID stuff and whatnot. And the Chinese were, of course, very strict on cracking down. So at one point, Kenton and I are kind of chatting, and I look over and I said, "Strange bedfellows, aren't we?" And he said, "I was thinking the exact same thing."
That's funny.
And it was really neat. So his expertise and his background is in ancient Near Eastern studies, Old Testament, Hebrew. At one point, somebody had said something about the Gilgamesh epic. The next day he said, I wasn't really sure that was right. So I went back and I read the Gilgamesh epic in Akkadian. And it's like, you just did that last night? Because that's what you do. Okay. And like everybody's head just kind of turns towards him in that awkward, like, what? And he was actually making the case that, in the Gilgamesh epic, it is a global flood as well. Somebody was trying to argue that all these different regional gods had regional floods, but the God of the Bible was a worldwide God, and so he has a worldwide flood. It's just a theological argument. And Kenton kind of comes back and says, no, that's not the case. These flood narratives are intended to be understood as global, the Gilgamesh one, the biblical one, etc. So, that's his expertise and that's his side of things. Next up in the book is William Lane Craig. And of course, Bill Craig came out with a massive book in 2023 or 2022, I believe, called In Quest of the Historical Adam, where he lays out an argument that the narrative passages of Genesis 1 through 11 should be understood as what he calls mytho-historical. They're mostly myth, but they are scaffolded by the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 to anchor them into some sort of chronological setting. But he doesn't think that we can really tease out too much what are the historical details of those accounts. But he thinks that genre of mytho-history helps us to set aside these from an actual historical commitment. So there wasn't a tree and a real garden. For heaven's sake, there wasn't a talking snake, and those sorts of things. There wasn't a flood. Excuse me, that was global. There wasn't a situation with probably two brothers of Cain and Abel, with one killing the other. He just writes pretty much all of those off as mythologies with some connection to history, but what they are, he leaves very, very open-ended.
Open. Yeah.
Although I will say he's much less open-ended about what he thinks are the mythological aspects. He's willing to hit real hard on what he thinks are the myth parts, like a serpent that is speaking to Eve.
Yes.
And what he constantly calls a humanoid deity wandering around the garden, when he talks about God coming down and making Adam and Eve in Genesis 2. I have a little trouble with the way that those frequently get presented by Craig. Very dismissive sort of language there. But nonetheless, he still is holding to inerrancy, and he thinks that inerrancy means that our understanding of this passage has been mistaken. We've assigned it to be historical when it's really not. And so we can still glean all the theological sorts of things. And for human origins, he really pulls only from the New Testament to commit us to a historical Adam and and Eve, perhaps. And really, it comes down to just Romans 5, Acts 17, and possibly 1 Corinthians 15 as well.
15.
Those would be the three passages that he thinks probably commit us to historical Adam. Definitely in terms of Romans and Acts, and probably. And every other mention of Adam is something that he thinks is, maybe it's real, maybe it's not, it doesn't have to be. And he does this in order to, what he thinks is to protect us from having to make affirmations of things that are potentially mythological or non-biblical cultural references in the Bible and taking those to be factual. Then when it comes to, who is Adam? Well, he puts Adam all the way back at 750,000 years ago, give or take, in a species called Homo heidelbergensis. And he thinks that would be the origination point of humans. And the reason that he does that is actually a point of agreement between Craig and I. And that is, both of us recognize that Neanderthal fossils give us enough cultural evidence of their humanity that we should consider them descendants of Adam and Eve. Now, I'm going to look at the Neanderthals as descendants of Noah more specifically and put them in a post-flood context. But Craig is not committed to a recent age of the earth. He's committed to an ancient age of the earth. And so he's not questioning the ages that Neanderthals are assigned to, for example. So, you can think of it like two branches of a tree. If we are human and the Neanderthals are human, then the point where those branches split has got to be human as well. And at that point, he pegs that as this species Homo heidelbergensis and says that's where humanity began, either with God creating Adam specifically, or God selecting Adam out of a population of these hominins and endowing him with a soul or something like that. So the details are a little fuzzy on that, but Craig is very convinced that at least the physical attributes and the cultural artifacts allow us to peg Neanderthals and us as human, along with the fact that we now know that we've interbred with them. We've got gene flow. That you and I contain Neanderthal genes and Neanderthals contain Homo sapiens genes. So, we should all be part of the family. And for that, I agree. I'm just going to drastically disagree on the time frame for all of that.
Yeah. So one thing that is very clear in the book, and I think this should be settled now, is that we should not think of, for those of us who hold a young Earth creation perspective of understanding origins, that the image-bearing status of people in the past is not limited to Homo sapiens, even though that's the group that's survived basically in civilization today, right? Mm-hmm. It's a much broader definition it's a much broader taxonomy. Would that be the right way to say it in the past? Yeah. Right? So it's interesting. You find there's such massive disagreement in this book, and yet there are these points of contact. And you just mentioned one of them. You mentioned one of them with Kenton Sparks. Yep. Oh, that's what the text says. And Dr. Craig is saying, no, the text, it says that, but it's not intended to really be historical. So interesting. The Neanderthal thing. Now, we've talked about this on our show a few times with our mutual friend, Dr. Todd Wood.
Yeah.
And it's very, very fascinating. So we encourage people to go back and listen to some of that. But I'm intrigued by the Neanderthals and these other people groups. Maybe talk a little bit, Marcus, before we move to Mr. Loke's view, about in the book you talk about things that distinguish like Neanderthals and even the controversial Homo naledi, mm-hmm. that draw them out as being distinctively what we would call human, like seafaring and burials and these kind of things. Maybe comment on that from a scientific perspective, if you would.
Well, thank you. It was a fun part of this project to introduce probably a wide range of readers to contemporary young Earth creation thinking on this stuff. And think about the Neanderthals. One of the things I mentioned in the book is that you can go all the way back to the 1920s. You can go back over 100 years and read George Macready Price's book, The New Geology, which was very influential on Whitcomb and Morris, for example, with the Genesis flood. And in Macready Price's 1921 book, he talks about one of the Neanderthal skeletons called La Chapelle-aux-Saints, which is found in Belgium, and it was found in a cave, and he was buried there. And recent work that's been done on La Chapelle-aux-Saints shows very definitively that the strata were disturbed. They were excavated out. The body was placed in, and fresh dirt was put over top of them. So there's a definite, physical difference between the layers in the cave and this little spot where he was. And Macready Price, writing in 1921, mentions that it looks for all the world like this guy was buried here by his friends. Like that was the term that he used, buried here by his friends. Now, fascinating. Chimpanzees and gorillas don't have friends in quite the same way that, Macready Price is talking about this. So yes. I think it's fascinating, first off, that we can go back over a century and see that young Earth creationists have been consistently agreeing and arguing for the humanity of Neanderthals at a time when that was very, very controversial. I mean, to the point of considered kind of crazy talk. And yet, as the years have gone by, And more discoveries have been made about Neanderthals. We have loads and loads of skeletons, and tens of thousands of fragments and partials, but lots of like 200 and some probably really good skeletons. We've got multiple places where there's burial. So is that the only thing? Well, no. As I went through in the book, there were a bunch of different types of hallmarks because we can't go back and test to see if somebody is a human. Right? We can't go back in time and look at them.
Yes.
And so what we have to do is adjudicate this in part on their physical form, but the physical forms are somewhat different. Neanderthals definitely have a slightly different body shape and structures in their skull and in their postcrania than you and I do. I would kind of tell my students that Neanderthals are like middle linebackers and we're like wide receivers. They are thick-set, stocky, hardy. They've got strong bones. They've got some curvature to their limbs. They've got their brow ridge, and the shape of the skull is different. We are thinner, more lightweight individuals than they were. And yet we still have this evidence of interbreeding, and we have these cultural artifacts that have been left behind by them and by other members. So I took a quick look at a variety of different species. You've got things like Australopithecus, referenced well by the famous Lucy skeleton. We have lots of Australopithecus material, but Lucy's one of the best known skeletons. Looking at things like Homo habilis, Homo floresiensis, which is a dwarf hominid that's found on an island that seems to be isolated from the world. Homo naledi, another dwarf hominid that is found in a cave system in South Africa.
Yes.
A variety of different Homo species that are found in the middle of the Pleistocene, like Homo heidelbergensis, Homo antecessor. You've got Homo erectus, which is a very wide-ranging form, both found across the Old World and for a long distance in kind of conventional time. Then Neanderthals and us, and then this other group called Denisovans, which we don't know exactly what they looked like because we don't have any really great skeletal material of them, but we actually have genetic information from some of their works, and we know that they mated with Neanderthals, and Neanderthals mated with us, and we mated with Denisovans as well. So we've got like at least this triad of species that we're identifying genetically. Which, I mean, when I went to college in the 90s and the 2000s, the idea that you could get genetic information from Neanderthals was unheard of. Svante Pablo has won a Nobel Prize for all of his genetic work on the Neanderthals. So we got these, this bevy of species, and we're trying to sort out who's human and who's not. And talking with, say, Dr. Todd Wood, who you mentioned, he's done a lot of work looking at all these different skeletons and using a variety of different statistical methods to kind of test, do we see groups of individuals similar to us,
Yes.
separated from groups of individuals that seem to be clearly distinct from us? And it turns out that we do. And so the way that we might check these groups, we can look at these groups as hypotheses. Do we and Neanderthals, physically we group together compared to, say, Australopithecus or modern chimpanzees? Are there other ways that we might be able to test this hypothesis of a broadly defined humanity? And so I looked at a little over half a dozen metrics or artifacts, cultural things left behind. So did the individual species have mastery over fire? And was it very likely, or was it possible that they did? Did they construct tools that were also of a sufficient build that that they had a plan? It wasn't just like an accidental sharp rock that you happened to use, but you actually had to shape the thing to look like something that you wanted. Did they engage in any sort of creative work, some sort of artistry or symbolic work? Did they explore in ways that simple migration is ruled out? That is, for example, did they have to go on boats to get to places? Did they cross seas or oceans to get to islands? Did they care for their weak and injured and sick in such a way that prolonged their life and took care of them? Did they dispose of their dead in a particular way, not just body dumping, but did they process the body? Is there anything about how they left behind the remains of others that indicated that they were cognizant of the idea of death, or maybe even had an idea of an afterlife? And genetically, did they have any evidence of interbreeding? And so when we kind of go through all of those, what's really impressive is that the Neanderthals tick off every one of the boxes. They used fire habitually and well. They explored deep recesses of caves that would have required fire to go down. So places where animals don't go because you literally cannot see your face, your hand in front of your face. It's so pitch black. Animals don't go in those places. They're dangerous. You get lost, you die. So, we think of caves with bears or lions or hyenas, but they only ever live near the mouth of the cave. We're talking about deep exploration of that. They made very complex tools. They probably were seafaring as well. We have Neanderthal evidence on places like the island of Crete, which was never connected to the mainland. So you've got to decide to get out there, and you've got to take enough people with you to actually establish a colony, right? This isn't just some accidental, I got washed in on a big wave from a tsunami. No, or clinging to some flotsam. That's not going to work.
Vegetation mat or something.
Yeah.
So you're saying planning, navigation, logistics, all of the things that would be required to make a journey on the open sea.
And convincing your fellow tribe mates that this is actually a good idea. Because you got to bring 20, 30, 40 of you over to some place, or do it over time. Just keep coming back to repopulate and bring in. Otherwise the colony dies off or has massive inbreeding problems or things like that. So this is all the cognition that goes into it. And when you're out on the open ocean, you've got to have significant language skills. This was one of the ways that I kind of said, let's look at a proxy for language is seafaring, because if you're going to get out on a boat, you've got to be able to tell people to row this way, row faster, watch out for this thing, we're headed this direction, adjust for the wind, right? All that's got to be done on the fly, and that requires very, very solid communication skills. So these are the sorts of things actually that, Bill Craig and I had great agreement on, looking through these sorts of things. In his book, he didn't really address them very much in his chapter for this work. But I tabulated these things in kind of a chart. I'm a science guy, so when you take a look at this book, you're going to find illustrations and charts from me and bulleted lists, because I'm that kind of abstract sequential thinker. I like ideas, but I like them well organized. And
yes, and visually in the book, visually is always helpful. It's interesting. It was a couple things. The things that we can, as the church, assume that lead us sort of in a wrong direction. So back 100 years ago, the assumption was if it didn't look like a modern Homo sapien, it wasn't an image bearer.
Yeah.
And now we've discovered, the Bible actually doesn't really delineate in the physical terms what an image bearer might look like. So it doesn't tell us, that the difference between Homo sapien and Neanderthal and Homo naledi, obviously there's physical differences, but the Bible doesn't really delineate that for us. So it seems like the theologians from that era maybe made the leap of logic that people in the distant past, if they didn't look like the skeletons we see now, they must not have been human. And there were people that were saying, well, no, we see evidence of humanity. And now we have confirmation of that. That's virtually certain, especially with Neanderthals. So it's kind of a warning to us to be careful not to extrapolate from the biblical text too much. Because in that case, you're defending a position that's not necessary to defend.
That's a really good point. And I liked what you said about, how we kind of were thinking about things in the past and who's human is based on what I'm comfortable with. And that's not my call, right? The only call that we have of who is human are those who've descended from Adam. And that's not physically specified in the Bible, right?
Yeah.
And we can see that there's always this pull to look at the past through the lens of the present you live in, right? So if you go to Italy and you go to Rome and you look at the Michelangelo's magnificent painting of the creation of Adam, right? Adam's a white guy. And so is God, and so are all the little cherubs and the angels that are around there. Like everybody's a white person, and that's almost certainly wrong, right? In fact, it's without a doubt incorrect. Not that I'm blaming Michelangelo. I mean, he was
That's
a man
the
living in a
context of his
particular
time.
area, right?
Exactly.
But he's looking back in the past and relating it as an artist to the population of the people around him. So we always have a tendency to do that. You think of the great movies, the Bible movies of the 1950s and 60s, right? The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston as Moses.
Yeah.
Really? We had guys
know.
playing Jesus who were Swedish, and you're kind of like, okay.
Well, my favorite Jesus is Robert Powell with the English accent.
Yeah.
With the ice blue eyes.
yeah.
I mean, that's the Jesus of Nazareth. Remember that miniseries in the
Yes.
70s? You and I are about the same age, so we remember that. I remember that. It stuck with me, in my thinking still now, that's what Jesus looks like.
Right.
Even though I know that that's
Even
not
though
the
Jim
case, but
Caviezel's a much more convincing Jesus.
yes.
Yeah.
So
and it takes us a while.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
And there's actually kind of a subtle, as thinking historically, I can't blame folks in, say, the 1800s for thinking that, Adam would have looked like you and I as a Homo sapien, because there wasn't anything else out there. And when Neanderthal skeletons were first discovered, there's a question of, is this a diseased individual, right? Could be. Why do they look different from the rest of us? And then eventually, as the concept of not only deep time had become embraced, but now the concept that there were other species, conservative Christians who were trying to hold to Genesis as a historical document were largely in the camps of day age and gap theory perspectives at that time, right?
Yes.
And they're still going to be looking at Adam and saying Adam was made recently. They were still trying to hold on to a recent Adam, even as the lineage of humanity seemed to be extending further back into time. So when you find something like a Neanderthal, the kind of immediate reaction is, oh, but they're not us. Adam's recent. And that perspective, that kind of prejudice just carried the day for a century or more. And it would be the young earth creationists who would, make this push to expand our concept of who humans are physically to include these other species. Now I say that, but the reality also is that within young earth creationism, there's often been a tendency to look at Neanderthals and Homo erectus as derivative of Homo sapien and say, oh, well, these were small inbred populations that were diseased in various sorts of ways. So you have these echoes of these earlier arguments from the 1800s and the 1900s that continue all the way through. And only now do you have folks like me, Todd Wood, Pete Brummel, and others that are saying, actually, it's the Homo sapiens that are the weirder members of this group, physically speaking. Like every other member of the genus Homo has a thick brow ridge and a swooping forehead, kind of no forehead, but like the cranium kind of swoops to the back. We're the ones with this really tall forehead and this, lack of any sort of substantive brow ridge and a weird little chin that nubs out at the end of our jaw. Nobody else has got that. And you kind of look at that from my perspective as a paleontologist going, honestly, we're the ones who look a little weird here. If Adam saw us, would he look at us and say like, dude, what happened to your head? Right.
That's so interesting. I like the innovative way. Now, like based on the science, right? So you're basing it on the scientific evidence, the physical evidence that's been uncovered of thinking outside the box, because maybe we've created a box that's not necessary, a box that's too small. And it's not necessarily small. It's the explicit teaching of Scripture that has to create the box, right?
Right.
Not assumptions extrapolated. And that's, we all do that in various ways. That's why working together, we can sort of pull out those assumptions that are unnecessary. Now Marcus, we do have one more author that we want to give you a chance to give a summary of his view. Obviously, you can't do full justice to your own view or to everybody else's for that matter. So, and that is Andrew Loke. Excuse me, first name escaped me for a split second. Tell us a little about his perspective. We talked about Dr. Craig and Kenton Sparks. So, tell us about Andrew's viewpoint.
Well, like Bill Craig, Andrew Loke is a philosopher. And his perspective is very similar to one that's held by a biologist by the name of Joshua Swamidass. And I don't know if you've run across that name, and we might have talked about it in a previous episode. Their view is that Adam can be the ancestor to all of us, to all human beings on the planet, if he's a genealogical ancestor to us. They rightly point out that the Bible never talks about genetic ancestry, right? Obviously, right? The Bible is written before any sort of genetic concept is around. But all of the Bible is tracing Adam through lineages, through genealogies. And their argument is that we can accept evolution and we can accept a historical Adam, a singular, even directly created historical Adam, if Adam is a person that is created in the midst of an already existing population of humans that God, used evolution to build up. So in Swaminadasa's view, Genesis 1 talks about basically God using evolution to create, and Genesis 2 begins with creating Adam. So he cleaves those two chapters apart. Locke does not. Locke recognizes, this is a point of agreement between he and I, that Genesis 1 on day 6 is expanded in Genesis 2 to discuss the actual creation of Adam and Eve. Yeah, so that's a point of commonality in the way that we understand what's going on. So Locke is going to say that it is fully compatible with Orthodox Christianity to hold that God could have used evolution, but then he created Adam, and that as Adam's lineage filters out into this other pre-existing population, he spreads the image of God along with the condemnation of death into that world. So one thing that's a little bit interesting about Locke's perspective is that all of the other members of Homo sapiens that God has used evolution to create are not human in the biblical sense. He does not consider them human because they are not descendants of Adam. So he recognizes that in order to be human, you have got to come from Adam. But what this means is that Adam is biologically identical to all these other non-humans. And it's not like they're primitive non-humans wandering around blubbering gibberish. They are fully identifiable Homo sapiens that have language, that have culture, that make tools, that are traveling around the world, that are erecting monuments and have culture and religion. And all of that still doesn't qualify them as human for Locke, because you can only be human if you are a descendant of Adam. And that's where Locke and I run into a lot of our disagreements with one another, because I don't think from a scientific perspective or even a theological perspective that you could have physically identical people on the planet at the same time who are both human and non-human, who act and behave in identical ways, and yet the bad things that one of these people does is not considered sin because they're not in Adam, and the other identical bad action is considered sin because this person's descended from Adam. And so one person's not condemned to hell for their evil. The other person is. One person does not have the availability of salvation because they're not in Adam, and so they aren't sinning, and Jesus's salvation is for all those who are in Adam. Then you have somebody else who is capable of being saved because they are in the lineage. That, I think, brings up so many theological problems that Locke does try to get around. But one of the things that's a little challenging with Locke's chapter in this is he doesn't lay out the genealogical Adam view so much as he assumes it and then tests it against a whole bunch of concepts that he thinks it needs to be able to check off in order to be something that an Orthodox Christian can hold. So he's doing what's called a possible worlds evaluation. Yeah. Is this a view that is possible within Orthodox Christianity? If so, it's possible. It might not be right, but it's allowable in a sense. And so in my response to that, I kind of actually write out a little bit about what a genealogical Adam view is in the first place, because you really have to kind of sift through the chapter to get the bits and pieces of his particular model as he evaluates, how human souls get created or whether this, that, or the other thing, comports with his model. And of course, in each case, it's supposed to be able to do that.
Right.
Locke and I have had probably the most spirited disagreements in the book and outside the book as well, because we had a session at ETS last year in 2023. And he came out swinging at that. If your listeners want to watch that, Bill Craig's channel, Reasonable Faith, filmed all of our presentations and all of the Q&A and all of the discussions. It was really, really nice of them to do that, and they posted it online. And you'll see, Woke and I have a pretty tense exchange. And part of that is because, honestly, theologically, we're the most similar to one another. Even though our disagreement on Adam here is quite strong, we're both inerrantists. We both take a historical, grammatical approach to the text. We both think that Genesis 1 through 11 is giving us historical information. So that separates us from Craig a bit. And yet his interpretation of that and my interpretation, once you get into the details, are very, very different. And so, as I've been telling people about this, I said that old Earth creationists and young Earth creationists are kind of like the cousins that get together at a family reunion. And we're in the same churches, we're in the same pews together. And so we tend to fight with one another more and more, vociferously. It's a big family argument when we get together. We also have more fun together than, any other times. But when you get to perspectives that are further outside the family, you get the second cousins and then the third cousins once removed sort of thing, right? You get someone like Sparks coming in and you don't have big fights with them because you don't see them very often. You don't really, you're not in the same places. So,
Interesting.
It's just as I've thought about my own experience and time in this discussion on creation evolution issues, young Earthers and old Earthers fight, and they fight a lot. They fight hard with one another.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think we should back off a little bit because we honestly have way, way, way more in common. And it would be helpful for us to find some of these points of commonality, even though the distinctions between us are important.
Interesting. Let's explore that a little bit together, Marcus, if you would. The one thing that's interesting to me is that he obviously clearly sees the necessity of the historical Adam from a theological standpoint, right? I mean, that seems clear, right? What you just articulated in there. Let's do a thought experiment. Walk this out with me a little bit. So we would have basically image bearers descended from Adam who look like non-image bearers who lived prior to Adam, merging together in terms of reproduction, and so their groups would merge. Right? Adam starts having descendants, and then this other group they would intermix with one another, right? They would have children and grandchildren and descendants that would go down. So I think I remember, maybe this was Swamidas, maybe it wasn't Lok, saying something. By the time we get to Jesus, everybody has some descendant from Adam. Am I right about that? Is that unique to Swamidas, or Lok, or am I misrepresenting that? Is that? Tell me about that.
You're right on par with that. So Swamitdas's book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, lays this out in much more detail, at least Swamitdas's particular take on that. There's some differences between him and Lok, but not too much daylight. And Swamidas relies on a number of population models that show that genealogical ancestry can flow very, very quickly. So there was a well-known study that was published around 2001, I think it was, that looked at the modern population today, beginning of the 21st century, and said that more or less everybody on Earth could be descended from these kind of ancestral grandparents as recently as about 3,400 years ago. So, a couple hundred, years, a couple thousand years before Christ, sometime around the Exodus, basically, is the time when these universal genealogical ancestors start popping up. Now, the further down you go in time, the deeper you go in time, the more and more universal ancestors you get. So that was a well-regarded study, and Swamidas uses that to anchor his own argument that if Adam is created around 6,000 years ago, then by 2,000 years ago, plenty of time. Everybody is connected to Adam. So if it only took 3,500 years then, it only it took 3,500 years then. I've got some issues with those, but that's the argument.
So the percentage of Adam that you have in you, as long as you've got a little bit, you're a descendant of Adam, I suppose. Because
that's where we don't think about genetics, right? We moderns tend to think about genetics and we got little pieces of Adam's DNA or anything. This argument says it doesn't matter if you have any DNA from Adam whatsoever. It's just, can you trace your lineage all the way back? And if you can trace your lineage back to Adam, you're in Adam. And that's all the Bible ever says, right? Those who are in Adam are available to be saved, according to 1 Corinthians 15. So as long as Swamidas's argument is that as long as we get to, AD 1 and everybody on earth is connected to Adam genealogically, you're not going to have any of his genes. You're not going to actually have any of his genetic material. That's been swamped out by all the others. But you've got a lineage, and therefore everybody at that time has salvation made available to them. But it also means that prior to this time of universal spread, you have got people who are not in Adam and people who are in Adam. And then what do you do with, theologically, what do you do with those people who are completely outside of Adam's lineage?
It makes you wonder about imputation.
Yeah,
right. That's the theological implications of imputation, the imputation of Adam's sin in Romans 5. Mm-hmm. I mean, we can't delve into all the details of that, but that's a question that just pops up in my head. The person in the audience thinking theologically has got to ask that question. Your thoughts on that, or how do they deal with that, generally speaking?
Well, for Swamidas, he's pretty well convinced that, hey, if people are outside of Adam in the past, it's no big deal, as long as they're in Adam by Jesus' time.
By the time of Jesus,
yeah.
Okay.
I don't like that particular move for a wide variety of reasons. Also interesting, like we keep talking about the image of God, right? Image of God is a term that's never used in the creation of Adam. It's a term from Genesis 1. And we often impart it over onto Adam. Think of imputation. We impart the idea of an image of God onto Adam, but the biblical text actually never talks about that because it talks about him being formed of the dust and God breathing into his nostrils the breath of life. So he gets the nefesh chaya, but the word image isn't used again until we get to Genesis 5 in the genealogies, when Adam has a son after his own image and after his own likeness, right? So really kind of interesting, because we'll talk, Swamidas will talk about how the people in Genesis 1 are made in the image of God, so we don't have to worry about them. God's got a plan for whatever that is. Then we have Adam as a special representative. Basically, it's a covenantal view then for the descendants of Adam that is not part of the covenant with the people outside the garden. Locke, on the other hand, because he combines Genesis 1 and 2 in terms of their focus and their time frame, he can't move the same way that Swamidas does. He can't say that all the other people out there are made in the image of God, because Locke says, no, image of God refers to Genesis 2. So that Genesis 1 passage is looking forward and then expanded. So that's why he's got to turn all the people outside the garden into complete non-humans, even though they're biologically identical. So Swamidas has got some moves where he can say maybe God can offer grace because they're made in their image, but Locke doesn't have that available. And so he's got to draw this really hard line between basically animals and humans that are biologically the same and interbreeding with one another. I mean, the whole point of genealogical Adam is to extend this out and do that. And one of the critiques I bring in my response to Locke is that I couldn't think of a bigger reason not to expand the lineage of Adam than the idea that these other tribes are morally and spiritually innocent, right? They're not under the suffering of condemnation of death because they have no connection to Adam and his sin. So if we've got some tribe that Adam's ancestors are approaching, all those people are not destined for hell. We don't, they're just maybe going to cease to exist when they die as an animal might.
Yeah.
But then Adam's descendants.
But they physically die.
Yes, they do. They do.
Physically die.
And so the issue of physical death becomes a question here. So for all of the other three viewpoints in the book, the idea of physical death is no big deal to them.
Right.
They're going to look at Adam's sin as, yes, he was condemned to die. Maybe he could have lived forever, but death, broadly speaking, in the world is not a problem. I've got more of an issue with that. But the fact that we have all of these hominids that seem to be human or show the same sorts of human capabilities that you and I might have, and they're all dead, right? They are dead. So if if you've got Neanderthals and Homo erectus that might qualify as humans, we've got their skeletal remains. If you're an old Earth advocate, theistic evolutionist or old Earth creationist, you've got to explain why their death in the past is fine. And if you think that they're descendants of Adam, okay, maybe Adam brought death, but no matter where you go in the fossil record, it's always dead. Everything's dead. And the deeper you go back, you're still dealing with death. I don't really touch on the animal death issue in my chapter, aside to say that I think that animal death is probably not happening prior to the fall. That's my strong suspicion there. But I also know the Bible doesn't explicitly make that case, although I think we've got good reason to think so.
It's a very strong inference from Romans 8 and the creation account. It seems to be.
The original vegetarianism of the organism seems to be, strongly implied that you don't have animal on animal brutality and that sort of thing. So it's not that no death of any kind existed before, couldn't exist before Adam. We have to think about that because people say, well, your hands and your skin are covered with dead skin cells, so obviously God allows death. Like, well, yes, but you as an organism are not dead. So, in our hypermodern perspective where we have a certain biological definition of what life happens to be, my skin cells are alive, but they're only alive because I am, right? And when they die and they form a protective layer, that's not death of the nefesh chaya. It's not death of the thing that has the breath of life. Plants are intended for consumption. So parts of those plants, those leaves and roots and whatnot, are intended to be food. They're supposed to die. Can you extend that to the animals? That's where I kind of don't see a great argument there. I think that when you've got original vegetarianism and when you see in Genesis 8 and 9 when the curse is, or when the promise is made, but the changes are there. Now human beings are going to be able to eat animals. It seems like there's some fundamental shifts that happen there. But that's getting a little far afield of the book.
Sure. Marcus, I wanted to do a little thought experiment with you just on this issue of merging these non-human and human lines. One of the areas that I've been doing research with, and I'm writing a book chapter on this with a series being edited by our mutual friend Hans Matawemi, is on the continuum of chronology from Adam all the way down to Jacob. And integrated with that are the patriarchal lifespans. Now, I know that from most other perspectives outside of Earth creationism, people are looking for ways to, or have posited ways to interpret those lifespans as non-literal in some kind of fashion. My argument is all the way down to Jacob. Jacob lives to be 147 years old, so we're well outside the time before the flood and so forth. Obviously, I can't articulate all the reasons for that in this short format with you. But if so, we're going to have another conflict with our old Earth, we'll say our old Earth friends, in that it's hard to conceptualize a group of people living outside of Adam who sort of live normal lifespans. I would assume that they would live 50, 60 years old and then they would die just the way that we do now. And then you've got this genealogy of Adam living to be 930 and Noah living to be 950 and so on, and then the fall off after the flood. Unless you want to reinterpret all those lifespans in some kind of way, it's hard to see how a line of people who lived centuries could be merged in some way. And that's kept all the way down to Noah. It's not like the numbers disappear. Do they deal with that issue at all in any kind of way, to your knowledge?
Very infrequently. Probably one of the arguments that I've heard, and I'm not sure if this is something that I've heard from Reasons to Believe or not. It might be their perspective, but if it isn't, I apologize to them. But at least one approach that I've heard about this is that the long lifespans are a particular blessing given to Adam's lineage, right? And that those outside of Adam's lineage, or those outside of, in particular, the Sethite lineage, get those ages, because we don't see ages given, say, in the line of Cain. We're just given, a brief genealogy. That ends, with Lamech and his kids, and that sort of thing. But there's no numbers there, which is peculiar, given that there's numbers in the other linear genealogies that we see in Genesis 5 and 11, and as you noted with the patriarchs as well, who are all living. And one of the things that I remember about Joseph, especially, is at the end, right? He says, "Few and unpleasant have been the days of my life." And
Jacob before Pharaoh. Yeah.
Few and unpleasant. You live to be 170, right? But compared to what? Well, compared to, my father, my grandfather, and the lineage that I know that went many more years than me. So that's an interesting phrase in Scripture that always stuck with me about, there's these lineages are long. They're long enough that even a super long living individual like Jacob says, I'm a depauperate individual compared to my heritage. But I think that's a very interesting point that you raised. I hadn't thought about what would that mean for blending in this lineage to other members. Because if you're an old earth creationist and you don't think that the flood was global, right? You've got all these layers of strata that represent deep age. And we don't see a whole lot of good evidence in the fossil record for some sort of extreme longevity. There's been some creationists in the past that tried to make arguments that Neanderthals were evidence of super long longevity. That would be Jack Quazzo. He wrote a book back in the late 90s called Buried Alive.
I remember that.
But even still, I never found those arguments particularly convincing. As a paleontologist, there's just too many other skeletal indicators that, one, Neanderthals aren't just an advanced form in age of Homo sapiens. That's not how we grow. That's not how our skulls develop over time. And also, we got a good bit of skeletal information from the Neanderthals. It seems like they're growing at the same pace and the rate that we do in this post-flood world. So another good reason to think of them as post-flood people, where the ages are declining down. So, I think for a lot of old earth creationists that are theologically conservative, they want to hold on to those long patriarchal ages and show that it's some kind of blessing. For others that are more in, say, the theistic evolution camp, they're much more liable to say, no, this is, just an ancient Near Eastern convention of making claims, about the greatness of the past and your group. So we can't take them as real, right? There's, better than me, all the different, contortions that are made to try to make the text say, oh, it's really a base 60 thing, plus or minus 5 or 7 years, or whatever. Well, it turns out you could make any number set you want out of base 60 plus or minus multiples of 7. You could make that data fit anything. So I haven't seen anything that convinces me that the ages are false or that they're stylized in some way. Of course, there's also the arguments about gaps in the genealogies and those sorts of things too, which is a separate kind of issue, but a way of trying to, amend this to deal with long periods of time. So, in the book Perspectives on the Historical Adam and Eve, those issues just aren't brought up. It's too brief. For that. But I've been wanting to ask you this. See if Craig said anything about it. I don't know.
Yeah, I've been wanting to ask you this question. Now he would just. I mean, I don't want to be flippant about this when I say this, but Dr. Craig would just write that off as, he was an argument from incredulity, like people don't live to be 900 years old. We know that from science. I mean, he's used that term to describe the patriarchal lifespans. So I'm not putting words in his mouth when I say that. So see, it's interesting because this goes back to the bigger picture of hermeneutics and methodology in terms of interpreting the text. The argument that I'm making is it's not just about singular data points. This is a whole across the scope of 45 chapters of Genesis. That this is all integrated together. It's not just about chronology counting up time, but how the lifespans are integrated with chronology, and they're integrated with small intervals, gestation periods, Genesis 11:10, 2 years after the flood. The 1 year of the flood narrative is a 10-based year because Noah goes from 600 to 601 years old and it has months in between.
Right.
So there's a lot that the person trying to reinterpret that has to contend with. Would you then think that, so when it says that, Adam lived to be 930. Seth was born in the Masoretic text when he's 130, and he says he had other sons and daughters. Now, so would the viewpoint be that the other sons and daughters only lived to be 50, 60, 70 years old? Like, it seems to me that you would have only people in the lineage that would live these long ages, but the others wouldn't. I'm not trying to corner you with the question. I genuinely have tried to think this through. What are your thoughts about that?
Boy, I honestly don't know. Yeah, I mean, because you think, okay, if you're a descendant of Adam, no matter who you are, you should be living hundreds of years. If there's a gradual, if there's a gradual tail off, as the generations go by and you guys decline because you've given yourselves over to sin and wickedness and evil and God's judging that. Okay, I get that. But also there's kind of the, to flip the script on Craig on that sort of thing. We have no indication in the Bible that anybody isn't living to these hundreds of years, right? All the people that we have that are in, this period of time from creation to the flood, of the ages that we're given, they're all really, really, really long. And so you're going to have to make some special pleading to say that everybody else is actually, living these really, really short lives, these normal human years.
But only the named patriarchs are living for centuries, but the other sons and daughters are living to what we would call normal ages. Yeah. It's hard to see how that's coherent, although the text is not explicit because it doesn't give us the ages for those other sons and daughters. So, So what do you do with that?
And then you hit the flood where, and this is another point of disagreement that gets into what you were saying about how we have to take the text as a whole here, right? The flood is a universal choke point, right? The entire human history or the entire human population is wiped out at that time and started over with Noah, who lives to be 900 and his son, 600. So we start to see that decline, but it's not because of sin pollution or anything like that in the lineage. The lineage is still considered full of righteous people, right? We've got to get from righteous Noah to Shem, who shows righteousness along with his brother by not mocking his father in nakedness. And that leads us ultimately to righteous Abraham, right? So we've got this lineage of righteousness that is declining in age, and a previous lineage that has righteous individuals like Enoch and Terah and Noah that isn't. So that's interesting then to bring that aspect, because you can't just say it's the blessings of righteousness, because why would there not be a decline before the flood? And, that would match maybe a decline after the flood or something like that.
Yeah. I think for us as young earth creationists too, Marcus, I don't know how we explore this because I'm not a scientist, but part of the modeling of the post-flood repopulation of the world and our understanding of genetics and population growth and all that has to consider the possibilities of the long ages that are there in the early post-flood period, and really all the way down to the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right.
How does that impact our understanding of the skeletal remains and the genetics? I don't know the answers to that, but it is a very interesting area I think should be explored by, the new generation of young earth creationists that we're hoping that God raises up to do this scientific work, right? So it's really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. There are some creationists who are, making some baby steps towards trying to investigate long ages. We'll see, kind of what comes of that. But yeah. And when the young earth creationist has got this, I think, very holistic, very well worked out system. I mean, prior to the modern era, everybody was a young earth creationist. Whether you held the days of Genesis to be literal days or allegorical, it kind of didn't matter. Your timeline for the age of the earth all started, with Adam or 5 days before Adam, right? That was kind of it. And all of these other perspectives have got to try to work around this long history of Christianity that's been thinking about this in terms of a young earth for centuries, for millennia. And at least I'll say this with regard to Craig in his book, he does do far more work than others in trying to incorporate Genesis 1 through 11 into his model. Whereas, and I do a brief kind of note, just a footnote on this, but kind of saying, most old Earth and theistic evolutionists pretty much avoid the flood altogether. And I list, a whole bunch of books that deal massively with Adam and human origins, and don't talk about the flood at all. Swamidas just says, it was local. This is an interesting problem for Locke, because Locke thinks that the flood was universal for the ancestors of Adam. So he thinks that the flood, while it wasn't global, absolutely did wipe out everybody who was genealogically connected to Adam, which means that Noah has got to be the one that completely restarts the genealogical ancestry that has got to get everybody in the world connected to Jesus by the time, to Adam, by the time of Jesus. And so this results in a very interesting problem for Locke's model, because if Adam's genealogical spread is so limited that a localized flood wipes out all of his descendants after a course of, say, 1,600 years, if you round the Masoretic number, then in the remaining 2,400 years, the descendants of Noah have got to go across the entire planet.
Yes, that's a logical inference from that.
And if the pace is so slow that you can't get beyond what a flood by the Black Sea or the Mediterranean, and we're not talking about the whole Mediterranean, we're talking about like just a region around this. If that spread of genealogy can't get you, to avoid a localized flood, then there is no hope or prayer that after that, Noah's family is going to have far less time than the genealogical models allow. Remember we said like 3,500 years was everybody here? Well, you got 2,400 years between the flood and Noah and Jesus. So you have less time.
And if you took the Septuagint, you'd have 3,300, but it's still
not going to work.
It's still, you I didn't even think about that. The problem of he's trying, I suppose, to hold on to some kind of historicity of the flood account, but he doesn't want to say it's global in the way that we would.
And its universality with respect to
descendants of Adam. Yeah. So really the timeline has to begin at Noah. The pre-flood Adam timeline is irrelevant to his model in a sense, because everybody's been wiped out. For some reason I didn't catch that. That's very
I have
good.
a brief description of that in my response chapter, and I have a couple of illustrations to kind of help the audience see. Oh, wait a minute, we have a serious problem here, because that means that by the time you get to Adam, most of the world is probably still not in Adam, according to even the most generous genealogical models. You just don't have the travel and transport capabilities that you do over the last 2,000 years, for example. This is pre-Roman road. You're talking about dangerous travel. People don't move around nearly so much in the ancient world as they do later on. Even in the later ancient world, that people were much more mobile than they were earlier on. So, those sorts of genealogical models run into some additional interesting scientific situations that the authors haven't really worked their way through. I've got a paper that I've submitted. We'll see. Hopefully, it'll get published in a journal to try and bring out a few of these kinds of problems for the genealogical models. Let me say this, one of the things that is interesting about this new book, Perspectives on the Historical Adam and Eve, is that the 4 perspectives that are in here don't have your classical old Earth creation perspective, a la Reasons to Believe, Hugh Ross's view, going back to many before him, where you've got kind of a recent Adam, 50,000 years or so, but an absolute direct creation of Adam, and he is the ancestor for all human beings, not these genealogical views. Partly, I think that's because that view is becoming increasingly untenable as more and more skeletons and more species and more cultural evidences are found that seem to expand out humanity. That position that Reasons to Believe still currently holds is under increasing pressure. And I think that genealogical arguments are going to become the next default for the more conservative-leaning old Earth advocates. The trouble is that when someone like Swamidas or someone like Locke starts to flesh out what that's going to look like, it ends up with a lot of problems. So I think that this is a viewpoint that actually does best when it's vague, when you don't have specifics. And I can see that with, say, like John Stott. He was one of the first people to kind of make this argument that Adam was, a Neolithic farmer living maybe 10,000 BC or something like that. And as his family went out, they connected into the rest of the world. And people go, okay, well, this Homo divinis model that he called it. As a scientist, I don't like that term, because you shouldn't erect a species name for a spiritual situation. You haven't done this right, but that's okay. It's really not okay, but I'll have to let it go.
Yeah, you have to, right?
But this Homo divinis model is basically the predecessor to the genealogical models. And as long as you don't flesh it out, it sounds possible. But as soon as you start putting the model to the actual text of the Bible, these things become very unpalatable, very, very unpalatable, because they bring you into these bizarre situations of, what do we do with people outside the garden? Are they human? Are they not? If they are human, what's their spiritual condition? If they're not human, how can we call them not human? And that was likewise one of Bill Craig's and Kenton Sparks' strong arguments against Locke was, how can you not call all these people humans? It's just unconscionable to do so. It's dehumanizing. Literally, it is dehumanizing to them. Yeah, and it's not going to convince anybody in the sciences at all.
No. Yeah, that's a good point. That hadn't occurred to me. Yeah, that would remain unconvincing. So, in the long term, our mutual friend Thomas Purifoy, the director of Is Genesis History, said to me, he thinks that the battle lines in the long term are going to be between what we call theistic evolution, although the theistic evolutionists want us to call that something different, I think.
Depends who they are, but yeah.
It depends who it is, yeah. And the young earth creationists, in the long haul, his sense of it is that's where it's not that we're dismissing Dr. Craig and Mr. Locke, but just or Dr. Locke. It's just that he seems to feel that that's where it is, because it's kind of like Sparks is saying that's what the text says. It's not historical. Inerrancy is an old hat thing we need to get rid of. And then on the other side is we're saying no, inerrancy is not old hat. It's actually the foundation and framework for everything that we need to do in the scientific and historical realm. So it's going to be interesting to see where it all goes and beyond our lifetimes, Marcus. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're working hard in these areas, and we're going to do that unless the Lord returns. But I appreciate very much what you did in this book. I really enjoyed your contribution. I appreciated your patience with your interlocutors. A couple of places, Dr. Craig, I thought was a little bit condescending.
Just a little bit,
just dismissive and really I was disappointed in his caricatures of young earth creationism. He's so much smarter than that. So that was a little disappointing, but overall, I thought it was helpful. Kenton Sparks is refreshingly honest, although I think he's just off the reservation in a way that I don't think is spiritually good, but
right.
I mean,
yeah,
I in my own opinion, but the point is not so much that as in I liked, okay, this is where he's at. This is where I'm at. Boom, here it is, and I think Christians have to wrestle with authority questions, hermeneutical questions, textual questions, and scientific questions.
Yeah, I agree with you. And having a chance now to have met Kenton Sparks a couple of times, he's a wonderful man. He loves God. Yeah. He loves Jesus with all of his heart and his soul and his mind. He wants more people to come to love Jesus too. So I really appreciate his evangelistic fervor. He really, really is out there so that people can know Jesus. He just thinks that we've made a big mistake in saying that the Bible is inerrant in the things that it says and claims.
Yeah.
And so I guess thinking about the book overall and its structure, right? We've got an introduction from Ken Keathley. We've got a wrap up from Josh Swamidasan, and we've got the four of us in the middle. And for the readers, if you pick up this book and take a look at it, what you'll find, at least in my opinion, I found Kenton's chapter to be very, very well constructed and challenging. It's tough. He brings out some really hard things for an inerrantist to have to respond to, right? If you're holding to inerrancy, he gives you all these kind of really bad situations that I think we have answers to, but at the same time, they're solid challenges. And he's very patient, and he works out his methodology. It's a very clearly written chapter. It makes a good argument. I certainly hope that with my own chapter, I lay things out very, very logically and very down the line, making my case from Scripture and making my case from the sciences. And both Kent and I's chapters are the bigger ones in the book. So when you open it up, you've got a big chapter where Kenton blows through the word count that we were given. And then I was notified that, oh, by the way, or at least somebody pointed out to me, footnotes were not included in your word count. So I blew it out of the water on footnotes. I kept my
nice.
Yeah, I kept to the numbers on the actual text, but the footnotes are just like crazy. And I've got all these diagrams and charts and things. So my paper takes up about probably a quarter of the whole book. But Kenton and I have the two biggest chapters. Craig's chapter is quick and breezy. I was expecting, quite honestly, a lot more given his book. But it was very, very quick summary. And Andrew Loke, I think, he certainly wrote something substantial, but his possible worlds model approach is going to make very difficult reading for the average person. To kind of see what he's doing. You keep kind of waiting to see the model fleshed out, and it never is. It's just constantly being evaluated against these parameters that apparently it's got to pass to be orthodox. And so I think that for most evangelicals, who are going to be picking up this book, they're going to read Kenton's chapter and go, "That's well argued, but there's no way I can go there." That's just, there's too many problems. Once you bite down on inerrancy, you start to run into, wait a minute. But a lot of what you believe is actually based on what the Bible is saying. So you're kind of assuming inerrancy in the places you want it to be inerrant,
Yeah.
So there's that.
That really jumps out, especially when you talk about Christology.
Yeah.
And Jesus's exposition of Genesis 1 and 2 in Matthew 19 and Mark 10 and the apostolic authority of Paul. And, you really got to think through theologically if you're going to go. And Spark says, come and swim in these waters.
Yeah.
Me as a convinced young Earth creationist and a theologian, I'm not swimming there, and I've got a lot of reasons not to. But he believes he's right, so he's trying to persuade people in that direction. But go ahead, continue. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, so I think a lot of evangelicals are going to read that and they're going to be like, nope, I'm not taking that pill. Yeah. That one's not going to work. And I think they're going to see the other three chapters and kind of go, hopefully, right? They'll say, the young Earth creationist presented a case that I've never really quite heard laid out this way, because a lot of young Earth creationist writing is very topical and it's very oriented at the layperson, right? The person who just isn't looking for a highbrow kind of detailed discussion on stuff. Yes, we have some technical books, but by and large, our books are aimed at lay audiences, and this is not, right. This is a scientist who has done as best as I can, thanks to some good friends and relations that are theologians, to give me guardrails, to give me ideas,
including your sister.
Yep,
including your sister,
Dr. Jillian Ross,
theologian.
Yep, and oh my goodness, did she just she's a hard editor. She's a very hard editor, and praise God for it. But folks like Hans Matawemi and Todd Wood and Dr. Tim Brophy, who's a biologist at Liberty University, giving me feedback on this so that I don't step into some, theological landmines that occasionally creationists do because we just hadn't thought about things. But I think that they're going to look at these two chapters at the end that are supposed to be like the unreasonable end members and go, actually, these two made better cases for themselves than what's supposed to be my two middle options. And instead, the two middle options are, I don't think that Craig's view is ultimately going to get much support. And Loke's view is not written in such a way that I think a lot of people are going to like it. And so they're going to be going, I don't know. I don't want the young Earth creationist to win. I don't want him to have, the best essay in here. And maybe I do, maybe I don't. But
right.
But I have been disappointed in the past with some of the other multiple views books where the young Earth creation position, comes out not looking as strong as I'd hoped. And this one, hopefully, plants a flag in the ground a little bit and says, no, we have a very, very well positioned situation here. We are theologically robust. It's not just Yom is Yom. No, there's way more to this as well. As you were saying, thinking about this across the long stretch of the book of Genesis and canonically, right? Whereas so many others are just like, well, if we can just understand how Genesis 1 is a little bit different, then we're all good. Well, that's just not true. The reverberations of the early chapters continue way on through the rest of the pages of Scripture, and we've got to be very mindful of those, which is why I think young earth creationism, as I kind of joked to ETS when I started giving my presentation, there's good human hermeneutical reasons why we young earth creationists just keep hanging around. And the audience chuckles because it's like, dang it, you guys do. You just persist, and you're an annoyance here. But, but I had people come up to me and said, I'm not in your camp, but boy, you gave me a lot to think about.
Good. And that's what you want. That's all you can ask for.
I'll take that. That's a win.
And I feel the same way, Marcus, and we'll probably wind it down here. Again, the name of the book is Perspectives on the Historical Adam and Eve, Dr. Marcus Ross, paleontologist, contributor. Pick up a copy of the book. I'll say too, along the lines of what you said, we persist. When I first became a Christian in 1997, I didn't know anything about this stuff. Started looking into it and became a lot of people say, oh, you young earth creationists, you're just that way because you're a conservative Southern Baptist or your parents told you that or whatever. Well, I got saved when I was 28 and became a young earth creationist quickly. And for 25 years, I've been a young earth creationist. And every time I ponder the subject, I just am more and more convinced of the view. Now, in some ways, somebody might be hearing that saying, well, then you're just being intractable and you're not open-minded. But it's really not that for a lot of us. I mean, there's obviously in every camp, there's going to be people that are, fundamentalist thickheads, thick-skulled, but
heavy brow ridge.
It's Neanderthals. But it's like every time I think through these things and I, read more about the science, it doesn't upset me in the sense of really panicking or anything like that, because the whole holistic way of thinking about this subject of origins has always been the most convincing thing for me. You can look at the text at an atomistic level, and I think it's justified there too. But this broad meta-narrative of Scripture, to me, is where the power of our argument, I think, lies. And for me personally, I'm comfortable with that.
That really resonates with some of my recent experience. As I said, I'm a scientist, and I've been a convinced young earth creationist from a very, very young age. But part of that was I started learning about dinosaurs when I was really, really small, and I became a Christian when I was young. And so I've been thinking about these things for a long time. I remember being as young as 9 and sorting through ideas in my own head, and I didn't have the terminology. I didn't know I was contemplating gap theory or day age or things like that, but I was. Right. I was, as a kid, thinking about those and weighing that against what I knew as a small kid against the Bible. But when I began this project in particular, and I had to go and start reading like every commentary I could get my hands on, and thankfully I worked at Liberty University, so there was a lot of commentaries that I could get my hands on. And I'm reading, Jewish scholar Sarna, and I'm reading higher critic guys, right? I'm reading Westermann and translations of Westermann. I'm reading Waltke, I'm reading Matthews, I'm reading Walton, I'm reading as much as I can Collins, from conservatives all the way through non-believers, John Day's work, all these sorts of things. And what I was really honestly kind of worried about at the beginning of my endeavor to get a better handle on the biblical side of things was that my young earth creationist perspective would be shown to be tremendously naive, that the text really is just not pushing me in that direction. And if I came to that conclusion, I would have to say, okay, well, if I'm not a young earth creationist by biblical conviction, do I still hold to young earth creation by scientific conviction as well? Or is that up for grabs? And I'm going to take a different perspective entirely. Should I just hang it up? And the more that I read from those who held to non-young earth creationist positions, which is like everybody, right? You start reading the commentaries, you'll find like one or two young earth creationists out there, but most of them are not. I was actually very surprised at how weak some of the arguments were against reading the text in that direction. That they were very forced. And again, they might work for this verse, but they actually didn't work 10 verses down, and they didn't work certainly 10 chapters away.
Yes,
You start seeing all these tight connections between the creation and the flood and some of the reverberations after that. And you see, all this happening, first off, just in Genesis. And you go, no, this is a very coherent system that's bringing me to Abraham. It is definitely considering a young earth. It's definitely considering our global flood, the physical creation of the world. The arguments that this is just, Walton's ideas that this is just functional creation or what have you, they just don't work. And so I was really worried, and in the end, very surprised at just how well I thought that the young earth creationist theological case continued through all those things. And I say that, and I know there's going to be people who say, come on, Marcus, really? But, talking with a couple of theistic evolution friends a few months back, I made this mention, and, I could see on one of them kind of a look like, seriously, you're reading all the things that I am, and you're still where you are? You're like, yeah, honestly, I don't find these compelling at all. And I was doing my very best, like you were, right, to be open to this. We want to be corrected by the Lord. And if I've been misreading Scripture, I want that correction. I want it fast. I don't want to be making an assumption, and even worse, teaching people something that is incorrect, because that's a bigger problem.
Yeah, and there's and these subjective experiences, while they're not the only ground for discovering truth, right? We're not saying young earth creationism is true because of our subjective experiences of studying Scripture. It is part of the picture, because everybody has the subjective experience of studying Scripture, right? So it's all part of the mosaic. And if you're seeking truth, you're born again, you're looking for truth. You're waiting for the Lord to correct you. And that's not an indictment on these other men who have these other viewpoints. It's just simply our own convictions about these matters. As I shared earlier, this whole question of the patriarchal lifespans, I started thinking, wow, they must really have a case for interpreting these as non-literal, as symbolic formulations. And then I started digging into the exegetical features of the text and how they connect with each other over long spans. And I'm like, you just simply can't do that with the text. It's incredible how Moses has woven this whole thing together.
Yeah.
And that's just one aspect of it. I'm just sharing that because that's something I've worked on. But it's the same argument essentially as what you're saying. It's this holistic way of understanding the meta-narrative. Well, Marcus, you gave us an hour and a half of your time, brother, and this is just wonderful. I hope I haven't presumed upon it. I'm so grateful for your friendship, your partnership, your expertise, and the way you bring young earth creationism into these discussions, because we've been, sort of the black sheep of the family on this issue. So you're really doing a great thing, and I appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you so much, Henry. It's been a delight, to be on again, to have you as a friend, and to look forward to seeing you the next time that we find ourselves in the same place. If not ETS,
Amen.
Then hopefully before then.
All right. We'll see you. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
We'll have a few links for you in the show notes. And one more time, the name of that book is Perspectives on Historical Adam and Eve, 4 Views. So that's the name if you're interested in reading more for yourself. That's all the time we have for today. Until next time.
Digging for Truth is a presentation of the Associates for Biblical Research. To find out more about ABR, just go to BibleArchaeology.org.